Welcome, my name is Paul, and in this video I'm going to walk you through 3 posters that I have worked on during this semester. Divided into discourse, method, and purpose, each poster contains a research case study and a research project. Following the work of Binary Design Studio, the case study is investigating the Seed Pod project and Mariposa de Acero. These projects are connected in the way they approach housing and equity. The research project is motivated by a personal passion for housing equity and an interest in mapping practices that I have acquired in the past 2 years at Lawrence Tech in my undergrad studies, and I've decided to take them to a next level during this class. Binary Design Studio was interested in home equity, but the way they arrived at their solution was pretty unique because they attempted to bring modularity and the study of plant life, specifically the desert plant life in Arizona, as factors that have shaped their research and design proposals. In collaboration with the Brooks Clifford Studio, the designers at Binary Design Studio noticed that there's an increase of the construction cost in hillside buildings, specifically in Southwest US. And as a consequence, they try to develop the modular living unit at low cost, inspired by the availability of materials on site and employing site and landscape as forces that can keep cost and construction down. The issues they were faced with were of financial concern and availability of low-cost housing for people who are trying to enter the housing market as first-time homeowners. So then they decide to look at other programs existent in Southwest US and structure their response as a low-cost alternative to those housing programs offered by the US government or private entities. Once the thesis was established, they set up the parameters that would guide their design, specifically low cost, a fast sequence of construction, short time, and the smallest available footprint for each module that would still keep in line with local codes and laws. The final result of their work was the Seed Pod, a modular unit that can be adapted to various functions of the living space, such as a living room, kitchen, bathroom, etc. Once I understood the work done by Binary Design Studio in relationship to equity in housing, I was interested in looking at Detroit, the housing market, and homelessness as issues that would shape my research project. So, inspired by the case study, I looked at issues closer to home, specifically Detroit, and how does housing equity play a role in the possible revival of this beautiful city. Housing equity is a very broad term, so I've decided to narrow down my focus on 2 subjects: the homeless shelters existent in Detroit and how can reclaimed materials from abandoned homes be used for positive good rather than being discarded that would contribute to more pollution and waste. Before I move forward, I'd like to give a definition of home equity and how would that affect my future research project. Home equity is the value of ownership built up in a home or property that represents the current market value of the house less any remaining mortgage payments. This value is built up over time as the property owner pays off the mortgage and the market value of the property appreciates. The more I understood the concept of home equity, I realized that my 2 potential theses are slightly different than what the work of Binary Design Studio was dealing with. And as such, I've decided to shift my focus from homeless shelters and urban furniture towards more preventive measures that are attempting to resolve this issue and not treat the problem. This brings us to method, because method is the next step after discourse has been established as the starting point of research. And When I looked at Binary Design Studio, I was interested in the way they approached their thesis, namely, they combined nature, computer science, and biology as three driving forces that shaped their design response to resolve home equity at a smaller scale, but still pertinent to their thesis. The main concern for the seed pod was thermal efficiency as a means to keep maintenance costs down and ultimately building costs down, which meant that the designers had to be mindful of the materials they used. The orientation of the module had to be specific to each site to maximize heat gain and heat loss and minimize. The seed pod concept is pretty simple. It provides an alternative form of equity in the building. The continued drastic rise of construction costs will continue to keep starter homes out of reach of much of the population, which meant that a new model is desperately needed. So the seed pod is like a plant, basically. As the seed pod protects and nourishes the seed in the initial stages of the embryonic plant, the seed pod equivalently recognizes the social contract of architecture to serve those in need by providing high-quality, affordable dwelling units to the large population that is typically underserved by the design community. Understanding that appropriate methods yielded good results for home equity, the designers created few 3D models that were uploaded into Ecotect to run few iterations for heat gain and heat loss that would inform the design of each module. And as such, the seed pod was then placed on site with proper material percentage that was thermally efficient at the lowest possible cost. What they arrived at was a module that contained mostly concrete and reclaimed wood that kept construction time and cost down, which helped them optimize the buildings into few of these blocks at the lowest possible cost compared to other buildings of same square footage and same utilities. So consider the two industrial land, a plant in the desert and a diagram of its growth, and how the artificial system of the seed pod module mimics that of the plant. Basically, the plant takes its nutrients from the soil, which comes from the rain, which comes from the clouds, which are formed by the condensation of air particles and water particles in the atmosphere, which are basically the result of the oxygen produced by the plant leaves, which in turn are growing from the nutrients that the root system is gaining from the soil through the soil. The same thing was applied and attempted to replicate for the seed pod module in the main analysis and iterations. Each module was tested for various orientations, and that resulted in two areas, blue and orange or yellow. The blue was the cold area that maintained an optimal temperature for each module based on the materials that What encouraged me to push my research project even further was noticing that the forces and factors that shaped the design of the seed pod were not strictly architectural, but they borrowed from computer science and biology in a translation to architecture. So then I decided to do something similar. After the first poster, and after gaining some valuable insight into the existing conditions of the housing market in Detroit, I focused even more on housing equity and what preventative measures can be taken to avoid an increased amount of homeless people and abandoned homes or foreclosed homes. For mapping practices, I used various GIS layers of demographics and available housing, foreclosed homes in Detroit, the price of an average multifamily home, and other similar factors that would help me identify and pinpoint the cause of the current housing crisis in Detroit. Among sources for my research, I came across a study done by Homemade America, which identified living under the poverty line as one of the top 10 factors that caused people to become homeless. So then I knew that I had to narrow down my focus on specific factors that are conducive to the situation. So then I came across citydata.com that has multiple layers of income, demographics, housing pricing, industries, and commerce in Detroit. Around this segment of my research, I came across the Detroit Demolition Task Force, which is a program funded by the US government in partnership with private entities and the city of Detroit that is demolishing abandoned or decrepit homes around Detroit in order to prevent a decay of the city fabric. What I found was very interesting. The areas that were predisposed to being foreclosed corresponded with an increased amount of homes to be demolished under the Detroit Demolition Task Force, which also corresponded with a specific demographic in Detroit that was living below the poverty line. So immediately I correlated these three factors as my driving for programmatic forces for the research thesis. I think this was my favorite part of the research project so far, because these methods helped me identify something very interesting in Detroit. Basically, by overlaying mapping with demographics and an identification of programmatic forces on site, I came across zip code 48213 as being the most affected area and the most predisposed to housing crisis and homelessness in Detroit. I think the method of mapping was the most interesting to me because it revealed some hidden situations in Detroit that I was not aware of. I looked at residents with income below poverty levels, I looked at real estate value, I looked at changes in demographics as possibly shaping factors of the current housing crisis, and I looked at foreclosures between 2013 and 2015. And once again, the perception that the zip code 48213 was the most affected was correct. The third part of the case study was purpose, and in this case purpose was arriving at housing equity using natural and programmatic factors by the designers to achieve this, and I think they have done it very successfully in a very pleasant aesthetic manner. What I appreciated about this project was its multi-layered approach to housing equity. That was nature, plant life, and ultimately the resident, which was the first and primary beneficiary. Located on a relatively steep slope, the steel butterfly had a minimum impact on the soil because it was slightly raised above ground, and it still maintained the central courtyard that served to ventilate the home in a natural way that kept cooling costs down, but also through its orientation achieved maximum heat gain throughout the day. Due to the fact that this house was more close to a prototype than a standard construction, the price was slightly increased, but this does not detract from the principles the designers employed to achieve housing and equity. The final stage of research is purpose, which in my case was the culmination of all research done throughout this semester. The final proposal comes from the combination of three factors, which are program, site, and the human factor. I have tried to adapt these three factors based on the programmatic forces in the steel butterfly and the seed pod, adapt them in a way that is specific and effective to the current housing crisis in Detroit. While the site in the steel butterfly was seen as a programmatic factor for a successful outcome, in my case, site contributed to a negative situation, but ultimately I have found a way to correlate similarities between various lots across zip code 48213 that led me to a more specific and accurate proposal. More than 45% of people in zip code 48213 live under the poverty line, or the equivalent of 4,200 households. This means that in the near future, a lot of these homes are facing foreclosures and will become abandoned, which will just exacerbate the problem and the task for the Detroit Demolition Task Force, which will have to demolish even more homes. So in an attempt to prevent the situation that would ultimately cost the US taxpayer more dollars, I am suggesting a diversion of the funds from the homes that are to be demolished in Detroit and giving those funds to the households that live under poverty as a short-term solution to allow those families to create either a short-term pension fund or enroll in college for 1 or 2 semesters or pay 1 or 2 months of mortgage, which might seem not significant, but as a short-term solution, it might be exactly what these people need, a break from the stress caused by the living costs.